The Law and You, a look at laws in St. Vincent and the Grenadines which affect our daily lives. The Law and You, presented by lawyer panel P.R Campbell QC and brought to you on SVG-TV as a public service.
Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, boys and girls, greetings. Welcome to another presentation in this public service nation-building series, The Law and You. This is program number 968, coming to you on Monday the 30th of March 2020. On this program, I will speak to you on the topic, the COVID-19 Pestilence. But before getting into the topic, my usual preliminary, I would like to send out my deepest condolences to all families which have suffered recent bereavements. And in that connection, the family of the late Marlon John, age 34, of Fairburn Pasture, whose aunt, or one of whose aunts, Mrs. Elsie Davis, Pastor Elsie Davis, is my fellow pastor at St. Elizabeth Cathedral, Belmont. Now, there have been shootings. There have been executions. But the death of Marlon yesterday afternoon at Fairburn was not just a mere shooting, not just a mere execution, it was a slaughter. The young man was riddled with bullets, apparently at the hands of two persons. My deepest sympathy to the whole family, particularly to Pastor Elsie Davis and her immediate family, on yet another tragic loss of human life. Secondly, and on an altogether more pleasant note, I would like to add a few words to the thanks and appreciation which have recently been uttered on behalf of the past Speaker of the House of Assembly, the Honorable Jomo Thomas. And I would also like to add some congratulatory remarks to his successor as Speaker, Mr. Charles, and also to the newly appointed Senator, Ms. Glasgow. Brother Jomo Thomas has a long and distinguished history of struggle in this country. But many people may not have known him from those days of the 60s and 70s. But the country certainly got to know him in the past few years, during which time he served as Speaker of the House of Assembly. Jomo served with great distinction, let it not be gainsaid. And I, on my behalf and on behalf of my chambers as a fellow lawyer, would like to thank him for his service to this country in that exalted position. I agreed with practically all of his rulings. even the ruling on which he reversed himself. You remember when we had the controversy over the no confidence motion, and he made a particular ruling allowing the government to amend the opposition motion, and then he subsequently wrote that upon reflection he thought his decision was wrong. Well, I still believe that Brother Jomo came to the correct conclusion when he ruled as he did. So I do not agree with him that he made a mistake. And in that I am fortified by the learned views of my friend and brother Dr. Linton Lewis and my friend and brother Dr. Francis Alexis. All three of us came to the conclusion that Jomo ruled correctly, but he himself had his self-doubt and felt that he had erred. His successor in the chair has, in my view, started off with a good sitting. He acquitted himself very well during the sitting which I looked at last week. So to you, my brother Charles, honorable, all the very best in what will no doubt be a challenging environment. And I was quite impressed with the maiden speech of Honorable Senator Minerva Glasgow, Dr. Glasgow, and I'm sure she will represent her party and those whose cause she will promote in the House with distinction. I wish her all the very best. All right, we move on to the topic for the evening, the COVID-19 pestilence, otherwise known as a virus. But I prefer to view it through biblical lens and regard it as one of the occurrences which the Bible speaks of as a pestilence, sometimes referred to as plagues, but to me it bears all the hallmarks of the pestilences referred to in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament. The authorities responsible for the administration of justice in the Eastern Caribbean have made certain adjustments to the normal procedure or procedures in litigation in the High Court. For one thing, a halt has been made to criminal trials for the time being. But on the civil side of the equation, I want to enlighten the public as to some of the changes which the Honorable Chief Justice has made to otherwise known procedures. For one thing, for the time being, as long as the pestilence and its aftermath are still around, hearings would no longer be in the court. Lawyers have been circulated with various instructions, and as of last week, we no longer will be going into the court for hearings. Hearings will take place in the offices of the lawyers through Skype. For those who do not know what Skype is, it is where you look at a screen, a computer screen or laptop screen, and you see the other parties who are involved in this hearing. So picture this. A case is called up for trial in the High Court. The lawyer or lawyers on one side will sit in the office of that lawyer. His client would sit in the same office, visibly either next to him or slightly behind him, but so that the client is visible to the judge. The judge will be at the courthouse looking at her, since we have two female judges, at her computer screen, and the other lawyer on the other side of the case would be in his or her office with his or her client looking at their computer screen, and everybody sees everybody else on the screen. And that is how business will be conducted for the foreseeable future until we are past the ravages of the pestilence. So that it has its advantages and its disadvantages. The advantages that the lawyer hasn't got to leave his or her office to go through crowded streets and up into a crowded courtroom. Everything is done in the lawyer's office. But once the technology is functioning, everyone can hear everybody else, everyone can see everybody else. When you look at the screen, you see the judge, you see the other lawyer and the other lawyer's client, who would normally be the litigant in the matter. If it is a trial and somebody is giving evidence, you will see the person giving evidence. Safeguards have been made by the rules issued by the Chief Justice to make the system as foolproof as possible. But that is how business is being done nowadays in the High Court. There are serious inconveniences, but we have to put up with that. For one thing, when lawyers are sitting at what is called the bar table, that is in front of the judge, lawyers generally have the opportunity to whisper things to one another that you don't want the judge to necessarily hear. You may ask your opponent some question or suggest something to your opponent, and that give and take, because you're sitting side by side normally in the ordinary civil court. But when you are hearing matters by Skype, you lose the opportunity to communicate with your opponents. If you have colleagues on your side, like senior lawyers will have their associates with them, then you can communicate with your juniors in private, but you lose the opportunity to communicate with your opponents, which is useful sometimes when you want to agree on a particular procedure. But I suppose we'll get accustomed to that as we go along. The system calls for close contact between the lawyers and the court office because it is necessary for the lawyers to ascertain from the court office that their matter is down for hearing and the time frame, because every matter now has a time slot, so that the lawyer will know approximately what time he will get a call from the judge's clerk saying your matter is now on. So that clients will no longer go to the courthouse upstairs, the Couriers building, for the hearing of their matter. They will check with their lawyers at the lawyers' offices to find out what and what. And it is the responsibility of the clients to keep in touch with their lawyers. If a matter is to be adjourned, usually the lawyers will know in advance, and the lawyers will be able to communicate with their clients to tell them, well, such and such a matter in which we are involved has been adjourned either to a specific date or to a date to be announced in the future. Service of documents. The bulk of lawyers in St. Vincent and Grenadines, and indeed throughout the OECS, have agreed that when they have documents to serve on the other side, well, first of all, when they have documents to file in court, the rules are that those filings can be done electronically. That is, you file them by email, unless there are very bulky documents involved, when you have to physically send the bulky documents to the courthouse for physical filing. But serving other lawyers with various documents will be done, or has been done since last week, by email. Many lawyers have arranged a dedicated email address to receive service of documents from other lawyers. As you know, the email system is very efficient because the email system records the precise time and, of course, the date on which documents are served. Lawyers have been requested to be as cooperative as possible, and we all have to be patient with one another. It will take some time for us to get adjusted to these new circumstances, but such are the inconvenience brought about by this pestilence. It has disrupted life as we know it. And I hope I will get a few minutes to talk about the disruption of life in the society generally. You may ask, well, what if the lawyer has to put a stamp on the document, the revenue stamp, normally you have a document to file, it costs $20 to file the document. You go and you send and you buy a $20 stamp from the Treasury and you affix it to the document when you file it. Well, lawyers have been given an option, and most of us have, in fact, practically all lawyers, we sign an undertaking. Instead of, well, there's no way of putting a stamp on documents of that sort. So we sign an undertaking to file our documents without the stamp, but to pay the government. And the details are yet to be worked out, but probably every month, lawyers will pay the government a certain amount of money for the stamps which are normally purchased at the Treasury. These and other subtle changes, and some not so subtle, have been brought about by reason of the COVID pestilence. So we in the court system have had to adjust our methods and get accustomed to new modalities. Now, the pestilence has affected practically all countries on earth. Some have been more devastated than others. I was speaking to a good friend of mine. He is in New York this morning on the telephone. And he was saying, look, in all of his life, and he's lived in America for over 40 years, he was saying in all of his life he has never seen the likes of what is happening in New York these days. That the streets are dead. Hardly any traffic, hardly any people. He said to me, his part of New York is like a divorce. He was like a ghost town. Because the medical advice in all the countries is that one way of slowing down the advance of the COVID plague is for people to remain in their homes. Lockdowns, in some cases states of emergency, so that humanity is going through a crisis that nobody alive has ever known before. They say that, once in every 100 years, sometimes twice, we get a pestilence of this kind. But the restrictions on gatherings, closing of business places, and compulsory by law in many countries, closing of national borders, is something new to humanity, except in times of war. And many of us don't know what it is to be in wartime, because the last World War was ended some 74 years ago. So the world has changed because of the COVID virus, or pestilence as I call it, or plague, to use another biblical term. There's a document which I would want to read for you next week, Monday, Divi, but I will just tell you a little about it. It is a proposal put together by two local Vincentians, one a civil engineer and one a clinical psychologist with a PhD. And they have suggested the formation of what they call community quarantine committees. I will read it to you next week, Divi. Because, and one of the authors of the article is himself right now in the 12th day of a self-imposed 14-day quarantine, in that he traveled abroad to North America, he and other family members, and when they came back, they went voluntarily into quarantine. No official had to tell them to go into quarantine. In fact, they said when they came through, they were landed in St. Vincent. Nobody asked him any question. They cleared immigration, cleared customs, and went their way. They went straight into quarantines. They are now in their 12th day, and I'll tell you about it next week, Divi. So he has first-hand experience of what it is like to be quarantined. And he and his fellow professionals have put together some proposals which they have already sent to the government, suggesting the appointment of community quarantine committees. Because from his own personal experience of being in self-imposed quarantine, he has seen the need. It isn't easy to practically lock away yourself, albeit with other family members, for 14 days voluntarily. And where quarantine is imposed on you, if you come in and the authorities give you a document saying you have to go in quarantine, you better keep yourself in that place. Otherwise, the authorities could carry you to court if you break the quarantine and get the court to order you to remain there. And if the court orders you to remain there, breach of that would be contempt of court. You go straight to jail. Would that be another kind of quarantine, but not the kind that you will enjoy? So I will share this with you next week, Divi. But fortunately, the indications are that the cases, the live cases of persons found infected with the virus or pestilence or plague in St. Vincent and Grenadines so far are few. Long may it be so. But we are required to follow the advice offered by the Ministry of Health to avoid gatherings, to keep ourselves in our homes as much as possible, to wash our hands and observe basic hygiene, and hope to avoid the ravages of COVID-19. I'll speak some more about that. So I hope that we will look to the Lord in prayer, because these are days when prayer is about all that we have. Prayer and doing the sensible, obedient things that officialdom has told us to do. And let me finally say that fortunately, our people appear for the most part to be abiding by these restrictions. And let us hope that the worst will not come to the worst in our communities. So that is all from this program of the Law and You, program number 968. I look forward to being of further service to you next week, Monday, Divi, for another presentation in this public service nation-building series, The Law and You. Do have a pleasant week, my brothers and sisters. Those in quarantine, bear with it, it'll pass. Hope that at the end of the period you will not show up with anything positive. And may the good Lord continue to bless us all.
The Law and You. A look at laws in St. Vincent and the Grenadines which affect our daily lives. The Law and You. Presented by lawyer panel R. Campbell QC and brought to you on SVG-TV as a public service.